I heard that there's an idea that every Jew, except for converts, have 4 AMOS of inheritance in Eretz Yisrael. So when Mashiach comes, what's it going to be? Like, how is that land going to be distributed? Like, if I own a house in Eretz Yisrael, is somebody going to come knock on my door and say, like, hey, I own your kitchen, you know? Or is it going to be reapportioned?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question. Originally the land was divided in the time of Yoshua ben Nun, based on the different tribes. There were 12 tribes that got land, because you're counting Ephraim and Manasseh as 2 tribes. And Kohanim and Leviim did not get a whole section of land, but they were given 48 cities throughout Eretz Yisrael. Now, once you have that original division, and there's a machlokas actually, I don't want to get into it, it's very, very technical, was the base of the division the people who left Mitzrayim or the people who entered Eretz Yisrael, because that would depend on how the initial division took place. But once you have that initial division, you then simply follow inheritance, generation after generation after generation after generation, and theoretically somebody would trace their Yerusha all the way back to that Yoshua ben Nun, which is quite a few thousand years ago, and that would be their land. However, that's apparently not going to happen when Mashiach comes, and the reason that is so is if you look in the book of Yechezkel, the land which describes what will happen when Mashiach comes, the land will be redivided in a different way, which will not correspond to Yoshua ben Nun. So basically what's going to happen is there'll be a different tribal division based on equal horizontal strips going from north to south, which is a very different way than the land is divided now. Now, be it as it may, there will be a division. If it won't be the old division, it'll be the new division. Now, if it's the new division, and you are in possession of land in the middle of somebody's inheritance, what's going to happen is you're going to have to give it up. Somebody will knock at the door and kick you out. The only thing is that they only own the land. They don't necessarily own the buildings on the land. So if you own your dira, they would have to compensate you for the apartment, etc., or they have the option of destroying it. Now, the same problem existed when you had Yovel. You know, when there was the institution of Yovel. So I buy property, I only own it for 49 years. The 50th year goes back to the original owner. Well, what if I built a hotel on the property? You know, remember when I was growing up, the Indians were claiming Manhattan Island because they only sold Manhattan Island for $24 of beads, and they were claiming it was an unfair sale, so they wanted Manhattan back. Well, Manhattan has changed a lot since 1658. If the Indians were to get Manhattan back, they would have to pay for the hotels and the improvements and the office buildings and everything else. So Yovel would be the same type of thing. They get the land back, but they would have to pay for the improvements. So yeah, you may have to move. That's correct. But all I'm saying is it wouldn't go back to Yoshua ben Nun. It would be a new tribal division. Okay? Yeah.
This week's parsha mentions that Yitzchak loved Esav and Rivka loved Yaakov. Does this, what is like the practical advice we should take from those lines? Like, is it that we shouldn't have favoritism because it leads to this like disparity that happened between the children, or like what else can we take from that?
You know, this always raises a very, very difficult issue because we sometimes look at the avos and the imahos and we detect what looks like family problems, it looks like relationship problems, and then we try to derive lessons to, our relationship problems. On one level, that's good because you're looking to the Torah for guidance and for direction. But you understand the problem. The problem is that, we're kind of remaking the avos and imos into our image, dysfunctional families, sibling rivalry, which is, of course, a great theme throughout Chumash Bereshis. Every pair of brothers are fighting with each other. So this is a controversial approach. I think it is a valuable approach to tell you personally that we should derive these lessons. But you might find yourself at the tail end of a cherem or whatever it is if you teach Chumash that way, because they will claim that you are being mavazeh the avos. But I will tell you this, the Gemara actually does use this, not from here, from another place, and it derives the exact lesson. It says, because Yaakov showed favoritism to Yosef by giving him a special coat that caused Yosef to be sold and resulting in the Jewish people going down to Egypt as slaves. So Chazal were willing to look at something as an improper show of jealousy, that caused jealousy. So as a result, all you're doing basically is you're kind of taking a similar lesson and you're moving back and you're saying that, hey, maybe Yaakov and Esav, the problem was that, one parent showed favoritism to one son, one to the other son. That created hatred, that created rivalry. So that is a possibility. But there are deeper meanings as well. I mean, obviously, one of the central questions, I don't want to give away my Friday night Russia, but one of the central questions in the Parsha is, how on earth could Yitzchak Avinu think that Esav was the better person who deserved the bracha? Was he taken in? Was he fooled? Esav asked righteous questions about how do you take truma and meiser from water and salt. So the Abarbanel actually says that Yitzchak was fooled. He was blind, and spiritually he was on such a high madrega. He didn't understand cheaters. He didn't understand deception. He didn't understand dishonesty. RIVKAH understood it very well because she grew up in a house of liars and cheaters. So she knew what Esav was going through. So that's the Abarbanel. But other people learn very differently. Yitzchak certainly understood that Esav was not righteous. But he loved Esav because he thought that he could give Esav some way. In other words, look at it this way. Rav Gedalia Shor writes, I think in the name of the Chidushei Harim, that a bracha is like a crutch. You're asking Hashem. They tell a story about what? They tell a story about a man that had a bunch of handicapped sons, and he gave all of his money to his healthy son. Because he said, the handicapped sons have a talent. They know how to beg. So they don't need the crutch. The healthy one doesn't know how to do anything, so I'll give him the money. A bracha is a crutch that Hashem should give you. So Yitzchak felt Yaakov didn't need a crutch. Yaakov could make it on his own. Yaakov was righteous enough that I shouldn't give him this artificial help so he can work and serve Hashem with his own Yegiah. But Esav is spiritually weak. Esav is spiritually defective. But I want to give him something. So I'll give him a special bracha. So the love that Yitzchak had for Esav is kind of the special love a parent might have for a disabled or handicapped child. The sense that Esav is powerful and Esav is hardly handicapped in a physical sense. But spiritually, he's a cripple. And because spiritually he's a cripple, I want to give him a way to make it in the world, in the spiritual world. So Yitzchak had a cheshbon. The problem was, RIVKAH understood that Esav would not utilize the bracha in a good way, so she had to take it away, so to speak. But that's what's going on. The love Yitzchak had for Esav was the compassion for a person who apparently was not exhibiting any type of spiritual nature. But Yitzchak wanted him to have something in Ruchnius.
And RIVKAH didn't?
RIVKAH did all. Well, RIVKAH in theory would have wanted it also. But RIVKAH realized that whatever gifts he would be given, he would not use them in a proper way. As Yitzchak envisioned, the way the Malbim explains it, Yitzchak envisioned a Yisachar Zevulun partnership, in the sense that Yaakov would be the spiritual one who learns all day, and Esav would build the cities and make the deals, and he would use his resources to help Yaakov, and therefore everybody's benefiting. Yaakov is freed of the burdens of society, and Esav is building Torah. That was Yitzchak's dream. RIVKAH was a realist. RIVKAH understood that Esav would not use his resources in that way. It's a very tragic situation. So you have to understand. In fact, it's an interesting thing. There's an interesting, not a medrash, it's a Hasidic word. If you look at the bracha that Yaakov thought he was giving, that Yitzchak thought he was giving Esav, he mentions Beni, my son, 7 times. 7 times. So there's a Rabbi who draws a comparison to David HaMelech. When David HaMelech's son Avshalom was killed, so David cried very much by his own general. David cried and he said, Avshalom my son, Avshalom my son, Avshalom my son, I wish I could die instead of you. And Chazal point out that David HaMelech mentioned it 8 times, because each time he wanted to bring Avshalom up from, there are 7 levels of Gehenna. So the first 7 times, he brought him up from Gehenna, and the 8th time he brought him to Olam Haba. So this Rebbe wants to say, with Yaakov was 8 times as well, that the 8 times is, he wants to bring Esav up from the 7 levels of Gehenna and bring him to Olam Haba. You know, just as an aside, if you go to the Kidron Valley, you know, between the old city and the Mount of Olives, Har HaZeisim, right, there's a valley. So you'll see some monuments in the valley. And there's a monument there that is called Yad Avshalom, the monument of Avshalom. Now, the truth of the matter is, it probably is not the monument of Avshalom. I think it dates from the Crusaders' time. But whatever it is, some people have a shita that this was a memorial of Avshalom, for Avshalom, who was David's rebellious son, who wanted to kill his father, who was killed by David's general Yoav. So we don't regard that as a holy place. You know, we don't go there to daven. But there was one person who used to daven by the craziest place. He used to daven by Yad Avshalom. This was Rav Chaim Shmulevitz. Why would he daven by Yad Avshalom? I mean, he's near the Kosel. He can go to the Kosel and daven. Because he said, he was very moved. He says, this whole story of Avshalom tells you the love of a father for a son, even when a son is totally unworthy. And even when a son wanted to kill his father, Avshalom would have killed David. And Rav Chaim used to say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we're your children. We're not always faithful to you. We don't deserve it. But look at how David HaMelech prayed for his son Avshalom to come out of Gehenna and get Olam Haba. Can't you look at us the same way? This is Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, in which he saw in Yad Avshalom a tremendous way of praying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yeah.
Actually, speaking about Yitzchak Avinu, we see, I mean, his own father made a shidduch for him by sending Eliezer and, you know, finding RIVKAH, but it seems like Yitzchak didn't really put in a lot of effort to get Yaakov a shidduch, and Yaakov even was in his 60s when he finally left on his own accord to go find Rachel and Leah. So, you know, why didn't he do a similar?
Yeah, well, really, I think, you know, you're assuming that what Avraham did for Yitzchak is the norm. The truth of the matter is Yitzchak is the deviation. And that is, normally you find your own shidduch. Normally you check it out. What happened was Yitzchak was in a unique situation where Yitzchak was not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael because he was a korban. So Avram had no choice. Now, why didn't Avram himself go? Well, maybe Avram didn't want to leave Eretz Yisrael either, or Avram was too old. So Avram had an extraordinary trust in his servant Eliezer. Even though Eliezer had a conflict of interest, remember, Eliezer had a daughter. So if you think about it, Eliezer had every motive to sabotage the mission. Every motive. And because then his daughter might get a second chance. But Avraham trusted Eliezer, and Eliezer was trustworthy. But the truth is, the normal things are that you make your own shidduch. And anyway, there was no choice here, because remember, Yaakov had to leave for 2 reasons. Yaakov left to find a wife, but Yaakov also had to leave because his brother wanted to kill him. So Yaakov had to leave under those circumstances. So you really can't expect Yitzchak to do much more there. I mean, if Yitzchak would have sent a servant, Yaakov would still have been in danger of Esav killing him. So it had to be that Yaakov had to go.
Why did he wait till he was 67?
Oh, so you're asking why did Yitzchak wait? Well, I guess why did Yaakov wait? Yeah. That's a good question. Why did Yaakov wait so long? 67, of course, that should give encouragement to people who are marrying late. Baruch Hashem, in all probability, you will be younger than Yaakov was when you get married. You know, I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I could say that Chazal actually say a person should learn Torah before they get married, and Yaakov maybe wanted to be Isaac in Torah besides the years of Shem behavior, which are 14 more years. But he wanted to, you know, learn with the Avos, etc. But I don't have a complete answer of why Yaakov was so old when he got married. Yeah.
Without wanting the rough to get any hate mail, I want to ask a question about Kashrut and Eretz Yisrael.
Okay.
My question is, when someone relies on the Rabbanu, for example, I understand under the auspices of the chief rabbis,
Yes.
So isn't it effectively that you're trusting their hashgacha? And to what extent can we rely on that and say, listen, they need to make sure it's okay, and I'm relying on them?
Well, hashgachos, as you say, in Eretz Yisrael, really all over the world, but particularly in Eretz Yisrael, are very, very complicated, and it's very difficult to get accurate information because many people will disparage hashgachos based on political concerns. They might say, oh, this Svardik hashgacha is no good because Rav Shach didn't like Shas. And there's nothing to do with anything, and the like. So it's very, very hard to get an opinion. But here's the thing about the Rabbanut. The Rabbanut is not some sinister, demonic, evil force that is deliberately trying to serve you treif so you'll go to Gehenna, as sometimes people paint the Rabbanut. Rabbanut are good people. They're from people. They're Shomer MITZVOS people. They're conscientious people. They try to serve the public. But here's the thing. The Rabbanut has made a decision, which makes a lot of sense. Hashgachos cost money. If I have a store, if I have a restaurant, I got to pay money for mashgiach. The more work the mashgiach puts in, the more hours the mashgiach puts in, the more things he has to do, the more money. There are businesses that are willing to pay X amount of dollars or shekel. They're not going to pay more than that. So, if the Rabbanut were to insist on the highest possible standards, and therefore the hashgacha fee would be very high, there are many restaurants and stores that would just not be kosher at all. So the Rabbanut made a decision that we will have lower standards in terms of how much time the mashgiach has to be there, how intensive do they check things, in order to keep the cost of hashgacha down, and in that way, at least it is under some standard of kashrus, rather than being treif legamri. Now, for people who are not so religious, this is a wonderful, wonderful service, because the Rabbanut is basically saying that most Jews in Israel are not going to eat treif. Most Jews will eat kosher even if they don't care, but at least they're doing it. The problem is, if you're a more religious person, Rabbanut hashgacha might in fact be substandard, but not because they're bad people, but because an economic decision was made to have a little bit of a substandard, meaning a b'diavad hashgacha, in order that a store should be kosher instead of being treif. So because of that, among B'nai Torah generally, I'm not saying it has to be this way, but the general hanhaga is that we try to avoid a plain Rabbanut hashgacha. So to say, well, it's their sin and not my sin, we don't really say that, and the reason is, that might be so if this were to be the only hashgacha in town. But when you have availability of higher standards, and you opt for a lower standard, you can't say to Hashem, hey, it's not my fault, it's the rabbi's fault, right? So as a result, that's why people avoid. Now again, in truth, even the plain Rabbanut is much better than it was, because most of the mashgichim are Haredi people, etc., B'nai Torah, and the like. So I am not going to tell you personally that there are serious problems with Rabbanut. I'm just really reporting the fact that most of the Torah community does not eat the plain Rabbanut hashgacha. That's just a fact, and that's based on the notion that the Rabbanut standard is deliberately more lenient, primarily for legitimate economic reasons, to encourage the greater observance of kashrus. And that's why the Rabbanut itself invented either two other levels. Right? They they have a Mahadran standard, and then the very confusing intermediate standard called Mahuderet. Do not confuse the two. There's Rabbanut Mahadrin, which is the highest, and Rabbanut Mahuderet, which is a middle standard. And that's precisely to give people, these options. Yeah.
If a Baal Tshuva, as he's becoming more from, casually takes on certain minhagim, not necessarily knowing if it's minhag or if it's halacha, and at a later time realizes, maybe this particular minhag isn't necessarily for me.
Yes.
How should he approach that?
Yeah, one does have to understand that although there is an idea that you have to stick with your minhagim, when you're a Baal Tshuva who is not raised religious, and you became religious as an adult, a young adult, you have to have some fluidity. Nobody's going to say, oh, the first shul that I walked into, that has to be my minhagim for my whole life. Oh, I walked into a Chabad shul, I have to be Chabad. These are the minhagim. Or, this is not an anti-Chabad statement. I walk into a Satmar shul, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, you have the right to experiment a little bit. You have the right to find what type of approach, what type of community you're comfortable with, what types of minhagim. The only thing is that sometimes when you've done something 3 times, it becomes like a vow, so you need hataras nedarim, which you can get based on 3 people, hataras nedarim, and then as you experiment with minhagim, you just say it's b'li neder, I'm doing it without a vow, and you do have a freedom to change. The only thing is that most poskim would say you shouldn't pick and choose. You can't say, for example, well, I like rice on Pesach, so I'll be Sephardic for Kitnios, but I don't like getting up for Slichos, the Haman Tevelo, so I'll be Ashkenazi for Slichos, which makes sense actually, right? But you can't do that. You have to kind of affiliate with some group. But, you know, it takes time, meaning I can't tell you how long it takes, and I can't really tell you how you decide what to do, but I can tell you, you do have the freedom to explore, and you're not going to be locked in because that's how you started. Because, you know, we have to check things out, and the only way you check it out sometimes is by experiencing it. I know it sounds trivial to say, you know, you got to go for a test drive, but to some degree, you know, even in Jewish observance, there is the notion of a test drive. Just like yeshivas, right? Sometimes the first yeshiva you go to may not be the right yeshiva for you. So you go and then you find another place, maybe it's better, etc. So minhagim are very much the same thing. Now I'll tell you an interesting story. The Yekkis, the German Jews, have very, very old minhagim, very old minhagim. In fact, some of the minhagim of Yekkis are older than the Babylonian Talmud. There were Jews in Germany, you know, before the Talmud was written. And there's even a story that's recorded that when the Talmud Bavli was composed and it finally reached Germany, and the Talmud is authoritative, right? The Gemara is authoritative, that some of the German Jews did not want to change their minhagim. And they said, well, how can you not follow the Gemara? They said, well, we had our minhagim before there was a Gemara. That's how long back it goes. But Yekkis have, you know, many minhagim, and among them is they like say everything in the siddur. You know, if you have a machzor of 1,000 pages, they say like page 1 to page 1,000. They say everything. Now, what happened was that yeshiva people don't like long davenings in particular. So what happened was in Baltimore, this was the case, an old Yekki shul, an old famous German Yekki shul, was losing members. As the old-timers were dying out, their children and other people were not going to that shul because it was too long, every chazanas and long and everything else. So the shul was on the verge of dying, so some of the younger members said the only way we could save our shul is if we get rid of the Yekki minhagim and we do like yeshiva davening. So the only problem was that the shul was founded as a Yekki shul. Was the shul allowed to change its minhagim? So they went to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach actually paskined any shul can change its minhag by a majority of the present shul membership, and it does not make a difference who the founders were. And that would even be Ashkenaz to Sfard. If you had a Sephardic shul that a majority of the members are Ashkenaz, they could go to Ashkenaz. If you had Ashkenazic shul that the majority of the members are Sephardic, they could go to Sephardic. He said there is no prohibition of a shul changing its minhag to follow the majority of its members, but Rav Shlomo Zalman added a following condition. But to honor the original founding of the shul, even if you're switching to regular yeshiva Ashkenaz, which is not the Yekki, you should keep some distinct minhagim of Yekkis to kind of preserve the flavor. And he asked them to prepare a list of like all the different minhagim, and he approved like 100 things that didn't make davening longer. That was the thing. In other words, it didn't make davening longer, but there were certain minhagim about shalom zachar and a bris and everything like that. So that was a very, very interesting approach in which you're giving honor to the original establishment of the shul, but you also recognize that sometimes that's going to change. Now, an interesting irony. So for already many generations already, the yeshiva population didn't like the Yekki shuls, they didn't like the long davening, and they wanted a streamlined davening where they could learn. In fact, they even walk out during the rabbi's drasha that I know myself from as being a rabbi. But now it's very, very interesting that a newer generation are looking back at the yekis, the slichos, and the yotzros, and the extra prayers, and they're now establishing shuls that are going back to the old minhag of Ashkenaz, because they see it as very beautiful and it's a connection to the past. So it's very, very fascinating that they're moving back and forth. A whole generation, like when I was growing up, they were moving away from that type of service, and now a newer generation is coming back to that type of service. So you will actually find in Yerushalayim and in Bnei Brak, young Bnei Torah are starting these yeki shows that say all the yotzros and all of those other prayers to go back to it. A similar thing took place, in a totally different context, about microphones. Baltimore in particular, I know Baltimore. Baltimore has an interesting little history. In the 1950s, a number of Orthodox synagogues in Baltimore were putting in a microphone because they felt that was the wave of the future. They couldn't attract people without a microphone. So the Rosh Hashiva of Ner Yisrael, Rav Ruderman, Zichrono Livracha, he asked two poskim. One was the son-in-law of Weinberg, the other was a Rav in Baltimore, I don't want to mention the name, and he asked them to investigate all of the halachic issues about microphones. Rav Weinberg came back that he was convinced that it was usher on Shabbos, which was Rav Moshe Feinstein's psak later, and the other Rav held it was mutter. He was a Talmud Chacham. He held it was mutter, and in his own shul there was a microphone. So there were a few modern Orthodox synagogues in Baltimore that had microphones during the 50s and 60s because they felt that's the only way they could attract their congregation. What happened by the 70s and 80s was that no from yeshiva guy would daven in these shuls because they had a microphone. So one of the microphone shuls took out the microphone in order to build up their membership. So things go in funny cycles. They put in the microphone to get members at one point in their history, and then they took out the microphone to get members at another point in history because the membership pool went to the right. They became like more religious, and the things that were needed to attract were the opposite in a later time. So the doros go up and down in these types of things. Yeah.
So this is a couple of parshas down the line that when Yaakov and his family came down to Egypt, it lists everybody, all the 70 people who went down. But it doesn't seem to mention any of the wives of all the 12 tribes, which the Medrash says that each one was born with their twin wife. So why not? Is it just because they're women? But there were 3 other women, including Moshe Rabbeinu's mother, which were mentioned. So
Right. Yeah, it is a good question. First of all, it's not so clear. I mean, there's only one opinion in the Medrash that each Shevet had a twin wife. But the theory seems to be that even though some women are counted, they're only counted if they're not born as a twin, meaning the twins aren't counted because when you have the boy and the girl, they're treated fundamentally as one unit. It's only a separate woman like Yocheved, etc., that you will count because they're not attached to an existing pair. Right, that's how we would count it. But one thing about the Maharal has an interesting observation about this. Rashi does bring the idea that each shevet, each boy, had a twin, and they married. So the kasha is, how could a person marry his twin sister? Even if you're going to tell me, first of all, under the Torah that's usher, but even if you're going to tell me, well, it's before the Torah was given, and maybe the tribes did not keep all of the Torah, but even under the Sheva MITZVOS B'nai Noach. In other words, if they're not bound by the Torah, they're certainly going to be bound by the 7 Noachide laws. I mean, you can't be excluded from everything, meaning you're either considered Jewish, so you have the Torah, or if you're not yet Jewish because it's before Matan Torah, you're bound by the Sheva MITZVOS B'nai Noach. Under the Sheva MITZVOS B'nai Noach, Gilui Arayos is usher, and marrying a sister is one of the Gilui Arayos. So the Maharal says a fascinating technical halacha. He points out that under the Noachide law, it is only prohibited to marry a sister that you share a mother with. But a sister from the father who's not from your mother is permitted under the Noahide laws, not under Torah law. Therefore, when we say each Shevet married a sister, that doesn't mean the twin that was born with them. Listen, you have 6 children from Leah, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar. And then you have 2 from each maidservant and Rachel. So you have 6 from Leah and 6 from the others. The 6 children of Leah married the 6 girls from the other wives, and the 6 girls from the other wives married the boys from Leah. So it turns out each Shevet only married their half-sister from the same father, but did not marry a sister from the same mother. Now this doesn't work if you assume the tribes kept the Torah, because the Torah clearly does prohibit even a half-sister. But if you assume that the Shvatim didn't keep the Torah, but they were only bound by the Noahide laws, then it's actually very good. The Noahide laws only prohibit achoso min ha'em. It does not prohibit achoso min ha'av. So therefore, be sure when you learn the Rashi, understand according to Maral, Reuven didn't marry Reuven's twin. Reuven married a twin from a different mother. Yeah.
What about the...
Oh, but there is a kasha on that. I'll tell you, there is a kasha because it's brought down that Shimon married Dinah.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, Shimon marrying Dinah is indeed a problem because Shimon's father is Yaakov and his mother is Leah, and Dinah's father is Yaakov and the mother is Leah. Dinah and Shimon are full siblings. How could that be permitted? But the short answer, is just really, there's no short answer, but it's too long. But basically, according to Targum Yonis and Ben Uziel, Dinah was actually conceived in Rachel's body, and then there was an embryo transfer, like a surrogate mother. So in that sense, Dinah becomes a half-sibling. But okay, maybe I'll leave it for another time. Yeah.
Going back to Kashrut, the Rambam says that if a person is surrounded by RASHAIM in the city, then he has to leave the city and live in a cave or whatever, or live away from the city. So what is AVRAHAM'S Havamina for disputing on behalf of SEDOM and Amorah? And what is the test? What is Hashem's test of Avraham if Avraham could just be quiet and rely on this chazaka?
See, you have to understand, I mean, when it's said, when the Rambam brings down this rule that if I live among Rishoyim, I have to leave, I have to distance myself, I have to put myself in a cave, I mean, that's not a direct mitzvah in the Torah per se. This is a bit of practical advice, meaning most of us are not strong enough to withstand our environment. Most of us are going to be destroyed by our environment, so most of us better get into a good environment. In other words, Chazal are giving you an eitzah. They're giving you advice. They're giving you counsel. There are extraordinarily great people in the world who can meet this negative environment head on, and instead of the environment dragging them down, they might be able to elevate people. So Avraham Avinu was indeed that type of person. Avraham Avinu's tent was open to Rishoyim, to Ovdei Avodah Zarah, because he was so strong in his emunah. Right? He's called Avram HaIvri, Avram the Hebrew. Now, Ivri actually means the other side of the river. Chazal say that the whole world could be on one side of things. No, they could say he's crazy, and he stood firm in his faith. I mean, let me give you an analogy even today. You have a person who moves to a non-religious area to be Makarev people. Now, I'll ask you a question. How am I allowed to move to an area to do Kiruv? Doesn't the Rambam say I'm supposed to distance myself, from negative influences? All right, so one answer might be that Bisman Hazeh, we don't treat non-religious people as Rishoyim because they didn't know any better. That might be one answer for Kiruv. But the other answer might be that if I truly, L'Shem Shamayim, think I can be a good influence, so I'm allowed to put myself in that environment and pray to Hashem that he should give me the siyata d'shmaya to be strong. So the Rambam's rule is not an absolute rule. The Rambam's rule is kind of a guidance to us in the way we normally face life, but there are going to be situations in which you put yourself in that difficult environment. Yeah.
Here's a send-in. I was walking in Ramat Eshkol on Shabbos, and a car was driving in the street. A yeshivish-looking man shouted, "Shabbos, Shabbos." However, the driver was clearly Arab, since she was wearing the traditional garb. I shouted to the man to be quiet, since she is not Jewish. He shouted back, "Hilalos umos," which I suppose meant that even Gentiles are meant to not drive on Shabbos. Is this valid?
Is he crazy? No, the person is nuts. If anything, I was going to say that fakir, the Arab that's driving on Shabbos is doing a mitzvah. A guy is not allowed to keep Shabbos. A guy is supposed to be mechalel Shabbos. Even a candidate for conversion, until the conversion is finished, they're supposed to turn on, they can practice, so to speak, but they're supposed to turn on one light or something. Now, maybe the guy meant this, though. I mean, let me put it this way. Maybe the guy meant that as a matter of courtesy to a neighborhood of Shabbos observing persons, a sensitive Gentile should not, disturb the rest and tranquility. Okay, that's a derech eretz point, and that may be legitimate, but I don't think that would warrant shouting it. I mean, first of all, I wouldn't even shout at a Jew, but certainly to shout at a non-Jew, I think, is totally improper. But to say that a non-Jew is not supposed to drive on Shabbos is insane. It's absolutely not true, but there may be a point of not disturbing the tranquility of a neighborhood. That may be a point. Yeah.
It says in Shidduch that if somebody speaks lashon hara about somebody else, and all the mitzvahs go to the other guy, and the other guy's aveiros go to that guy. What does that mean?
Yeah. If I remember, I think it's from the CHOVOS HALEVAVOS. I don't think it's from Mesilas Yesharim. The CHOVOS HALEVAVOS actually says that chiddush, that there's kind of a transference. Reuven speaks lashon hara about Shimon, so Reuven gets all of Shimon's aveiros, and Shimon gets all of Reuven's mitzvos. This is actually one of the strangest statements in the CHOVOS HALEVAVOS, and there actually is no makor in Chazal for this. I mean, normally you'd expect there'd be a medrash or a gemara. There actually is no makor, and the Meforshim have a lot of trouble just even understanding exactly what that means. But the concept, Rav Dessler has an arichas. Rav Dessler tries to explain this, and it is a bit of a dochek, but the basic idea is that if I speak lashon hara about somebody, and I demean him, so to speak, and as I'm mavazeh him, so the bizayin becomes a kapara for his averos, right? The bizayin that he suffers by my lashon hara gives him an atonement. But on the other hand, since he hasn't actually been punished, Hashem has to find some avenue where the din that this Rasha is chayav will still be makoyim. So since I was the one that was gairem, that Hashem is not going to be ma'anish him, so I got to get the einish. Now, in terms of, so that explains partially why I get his averos. Why does he get my mitzvahs? That I don't know. I don't remember. I'll try to check it up and get back to you. But if you want to find it yourself, it's in the Michtav Me'Eliyahu. He gives a long hesper regarding the switch. But it is a chiddush of the CHOVOS HALEVAVOS, and it does not have a makar in Chazal.
Doesn't he bring down that when you come to Shemayim, there's going to be so many different mitzvahs and aveiros because you're not getting enough, because they're going to be getting other people.
Yeah, because of that. Yeah. Now, I'm saying he does say that, but I'm saying, but it's not from Chazal. It's his own. I mean, the CHOVOS HALEVAVOS was a rishon. He could say a chiddush, but it is his chiddush. By the way, there is another aspect in which, after 120 years, there'll be many mitzvos that we didn't know that we did, and unfortunately, many aveiros. They tell the story about a guy. It's a really interesting story about a multi-millionaire who was not from, and he came to Eretz Yisrael, and he was really amazed to see yeshivos and learning and davening, and it really moved him. And at the Kotel, he saw a Hasidic Avrech who was crying and sobbing, and he was so moved by the kavanah that this Avrech had in his prayer that he gave like $20 million to something, to some yeshiva, or whatever it is. And like the day after he gave the $20 million, he had a heart attack and he died. And it's been pointed out that when this Avrech goes to Shemayim, he's going to have in his mitzvah account that, look at the magnificent yeshivos that you built because of the $20 million that was given because of you. And the Avrach says, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't have the money. I didn't know anybody with the money. I never met anybody with the money. But somebody saw you davening, and they gave the money. So that becomes your mitzvah. That's a wonderful thing. Of course, the downside of that is it could happen with Averis too. We behave a certain way, we push somebody, we're rude, we're mean, and somebody happens to be watching us and says, I was going to write that check to Or Sameach, but I'm going to rip it up. I'm going to give it to Hebrew University instead. So after 120 years, he says, you took away $10,000. Won't be 20 million. We don't get that type of donation. But you took away $10,000 from Or Sameach. What did I do? He says, yeah, the guy ripped up the check because of you. So it goes both ways. There's a lot of good things that we do that we don't know. And there are bad things that we unfortunately cause that we don't know. So we have to be careful in what we do. Yeah.
When Avraham is about to go down to Mitzrayim for the first time, he says to Sarah, pretend you're my sister, because when they turn see you, they'll say, they'll kill me if you appear as my wife. But Rashi says that he brought her down in a box. So why is he worried about this if she is in theory, not exposed to anyone and they can't see her?
Yes. So again, mimanashach, right? If she's covered up, she's in hiding, she's in concealment, what is he afraid of? But again, just in terms of simple pshat, being in a box doesn't mean, she's locked up 24 hours a day. In the course of time, listen, if she never encounters anybody, then she doesn't have to say anything. So obviously what Avraham is saying is, in the event, and indeed it happens, right? It did happen. In the event, you step out for some air or whatever it would be, and they see how beautiful you are, this is our contingency plan. You understand a contingency plan, and indeed, apparently she did take a walk sometimes, otherwise why did they do it? It reminds me a little bit of the Holocaust. This was sometimes a problem for Jews in the Holocaust. There were Jews that were in hiding, like Anne Frank. They were in these narrow bunkers. And really, you were suffocating. Imagine you had, let's say 5 people had to be in something the size of under this table for the whole day. The goyim that were hiding them, Chasidei Umos Olam would give them food, etc. And there were people who literally went stir crazy. They were risking their lives if they left. But they had to leave. They had to get out, hoping that nothing would happen. Very often they went out, they were caught. So being in a box is not the easiest thing. You can imagine that Sarah, went out a little bit, and she was vulnerable at that point. So they had to have a contingency plan there. Yeah.
I've heard sometimes people call the Zionists RASHAIM and all these types of things.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, you have the concept of Tinam Shemishpah. And
Yeah.
you talk about if you've been exposed, you haven't been exposed, but I have a hard time with anyone who hasn't sat and learned in a correct and proper way that anyone can call them a Rasha in any way, unless someone's actually learned and they at least reject it. What are the guidelines in terms of these types of issues?
Again, it depends who you ask. I very much agree with what you're saying. There's a Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish was not a modern Orthodox lenient person, right? The Chazon Ish was the Chazon Ish, the great gadol of the prior generation. And the Chazon Ish writes in Yoredeya that the categories that Chazal use about Rishaim do not apply to secular Jews today. And he doesn't use the word Tinuk Shnei. He seems to imply, even if they're not Tinuk Shnei, they had some background. But we live in a world of darkness. We live in a world where most of the Jews are not religious. So to be not religious, you're not rebelling, you're not fighting God. This is just normal life. We don't have nevuah, we don't have kedusha, we don't have insight. So people are ignorant or people are misinformed, and you cannot really use the name Russia about them. And the Chazon Ish says you have to draw them to Torah. This is a very beautiful phrase from the Navi Hosea, but the Chazon Ish uses it. Biavosos ava. Avosos ava means ropes. Avosos are ropes of love. You bring them to Yiddishkeit by love. Nobody, I'm almost willing to say nobody has ever done teshuva by being called a rasha. I mean, what is someone's reaction when they're called a rasha? They hate you more, and they hate what you stand for more. They'll either shut you off and ignore you, or they'll fight you and attack you. They're not going to say, "Whoa, I didn't realize I was a rasha. Thank you for telling me." You know, that's not, maybe it should work that way, but, you know, that doesn't work that way. And again, I'm not even saying it about them. I'll say it about us, you know, and the like. So I agree that the word rasha is used too indiscriminately. Now, some say, some of the early Zionists, the early secular Zionists, I mean secular Zionists, were in fact people who even went to yeshiva and were, you know, so there may be some category there. Some of the maskilim in Europe were that way. They came from religious homes and they really had a very good chinuch. They were genuine apikorsim, so to speak. You know the story about apikoros. To be an apikoros, you got to know something. An ignorant person is not an apikoros, he's just an amhoritz. I told you the story before, that there was a guy in Minsk who wanted to be an apikoros. Says he's not. So he was told, well, you got to go to Yussel. Yussel is the official apikoros of Minsk. So where do you find him? So he figured, I'll go to the bars, I'll go to the hotels, I'll go to the treif restaurants, the casinos. Wasn't there. Finally, he's directed to a beis medrash. And the only person in the beis medrash is a guy with a long white beard and a talus over his head. And he's sitting over a big Gemara thinking. Doesn't look like an apikoros. So he says, hey, you know, I'm looking for Yussel, the apikoros. He says, yeah, that's me. He says, well, you know, I want to be like you. I want to be an apikoros. So Yussel says, have you finished Shas? He says, no, I didn't finish Shas. I don't believe in it. Why should I finish Shas? He says, do you know Chumash and Rashi? He says, no, I don't believe in it. He says, you're no apikoros, you're just ignorant. And this goes back. So it takes a certain madrega to be an apikoros. Not so easy to be an apikoros, you know, as it were. So there may be a few. But by and large, that's not the case. That's not the case today. And if you want to bring people to Torah and you want to make a Kiddush Hashem, you have to be a little kind. Now, in defense, though, let me just say, in defense of the use of harsh language, which I don't think is right, so I'm going to give you a defense, but it's not right. That is, if you are afraid that these bad ideas will influence people and pull them in the wrong direction, so sometimes people use very harsh language in order to kind of teach our children not to be nimshach. So there is a makom for that type of approach, but as I say, by and large, I don't think it's a healthy one and a correct one. Yeah.
Could I ever give some mahalach to understand the whole incident with Yaakov tricking Yitzchak? I know, like from the actual Chazal, I mean, Rasha has a different approach to it. From the Chazal, it does seem like Yaakov in some way was like forced, very uncomfortable doing what he did. And I just want to know, like, how could a bracha with so much that he was planning and having so much fruition and blessing come from be done in a deceitful way? And B was that how could Yitzchak like love Esau? It seemed like inside it, like he pushed out like inside the kid. So he seemed like he knew that he had a tendency to doing bad things. So.
Right. So that last point I did address earlier tonight already, and that is Yitzchak knew that Esav was not a tzaddik. Yitzchak knew that. But Esav did have milas. Esav did have certain qualities. Esav was a go-getter. Esav was an activist. So Yaakov envisioned that if we can harness Esav's kochos in a very positive way, he could help Yaakov in his mission. So Esav was not the guy who could sit in the beis medrash. But Esav was the guy who could build a beis medrash. Esav was the guy that can get the building done. He could do the financing. So Yitzchak wanted to give Esav that particular bracha. Now, RIVKAH understood, because she understood duplicity, that Esav was not going to use his kochos in that way, and therefore the bracha was given to Yaakov. Now, the other question though is more disturbing, and that is, this is not a magic spell. I mean, if Yitzchak intended to bless Esav What, it's like a magic thing? I got the ray. It's like I'm shooting a ray gun. I got the ray, you know. I mean, he meant it for Esav. So why does it go to Yaakov at all? So it first says, it's very, very clear that once Yitzchak understood that he was deceived, it was from Hashem. And this is the way it should be. Meaning, if Yitzchak could have said, hey, I meant Esav, I didn't mean you. Get out of here. That would have ended it. But Yitzchak validated the decision afterwards. Huh?
After the blessing.
Yes, after the blessing, he understood. He understood, Me Hashem Yatza Hadover. But there's something very powerful in the Medrash I want to tell you. You know the saying, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword? Well, I think it may be from the Christian Bible, but it's a well-known saying that people have. The Medrash says a powerful thing. Because of Yaakov's deception. Was it justified? Yes, it had to be, it had to be, it had to be, it had to be. Yaakov suffered tremendously. Yaakov goes to Lavan's house. He is victimized by deception after deception. He works 7 years for Rachel. He gets Leah. And then Lavan cheats him over and over and over again. And then Yosef is stolen from him. And Yaakov is lied to, thinking that Yosef was killed by a wild animal. What is the Medrash saying? You cause pain to another person, it's going to come back and hurt you. And the Medrash says further, or the Gemara says, that when Esav comes back and discovers that the brachos were given to Yaakov, so what does the Chumash say? Vayizak za'aka gedayla umara. Esav cried a loud and bitter cry. Now that lashon appears one other place in Tanakh. The same words. It appears when Haman, when Mordechai is informed that Haman wants to destroy the Jewish people, Mordechai cries a loud and bitter cry. Says the Gemara, because Yaakov caused Esav to cry a loud and bitter cry, a descendant of Esav, that's Haman, who comes from Amalek, caused the descendant of Yaakov to have a loud and bitter cry. This is before computers. Chazal noticed the same words appear. Right? We wouldn't automatically notice that. Same words appear. Rav Chaim Shmulevitz explains like this. I mean, is Yaakov being punished here? I mean, Yaakov did what he was supposed to do. Rav Chaim Shmulevitz says like this. It's not a matter of punishment. It's a law of spiritual nature. Let me give you an example. Let's imagine there's a fire. And you're walking by, and God forbid, a baby is in the fire. The baby's going to be burnt to death. So you dive into the fire to rescue the baby. Did you do a good thing? Did you do a right thing? You did a wonderful thing. But just because you did a wonderful thing doesn't mean you're not going to get burnt. It's not that the burning is a punishment for some sin. The burning is a consequence. Chaim Shmulevitz says, causing pain to other people is like jumping into a fire. You cause pain to other people, it's going to come back and hurt you. Now, sometimes you got to be willing to take that cost. But know that there's a cost. We sometimes are so makel. Oh, I'm acting l'shem shamayim, so I hurt the guy. It's l'shem shamayim. Okay, maybe so. But that doesn't protect you. There's going to be some consequence. So, if you're going to be l'shem shamayim, be sure that you're l'shem shamayim. Because there's no freebie that you're going to get because you think you have noble intentions. Yeah?
I just wanted to follow up on my question about Ibn Ezra.
Yeah.
I know you already responded.
Yeah.
Put it on the camera.
You want to put it on the record? Okay, so let me just explain what the question is. It's an interesting chronological question. In the covenant of the parts, the Bris Bein Absarim Parshas Lech Lecha, God says your children will be enslaved in a land that is not theirs for 400 years. And the nation that enslaves them I will judge, and they will leave with great wealth. Rashi raises the question, how do you get 400 years? the Jewish people were in Mitzrayim only 210 years. Where's the 400 years? So Rashi points out the 400 years run from the birth of Yitzchak. So Rashi says from the birth of Yitzchak to Yetzias Mitzrayim is 400 years. Now, there's a third number. It says in Parshas Bo that the Jewish people were in Mitzrayim 430 years. Where do you get 430? So Rashi says in Bo, he doesn't say in Lech Lecha, that the 430 is from the covenant itself. So the covenant was when Avram was 70. The birth of Yitzchak was 30 years later, and 400 years from there was Yetzias Mitzrayim. So according to Rashi, all three dates work out very well. 430, 400, 210. 210 from the time Yaakov came to Mitzrayim till the time we left. 400 from the birth of Yitzchak. 430 from the bris bein habsarim. The only problem with Rashi is that means Avraham was 70 years old at the time of the bris bein habsarim, because Yitzchak was born when Avraham was 100, and yet Lech Lecha says he came to Eretz Yisrael at 75. So according to Rashi, all the Mefarshim say we have to posit that Avraham had made an earlier trip to Eretz. The bris bein habsarim was Avraham's pilot aliyah trip, which he then went back to Haran, and Lech Lecha is the second trip, and the Torah is not in chronological order. This is Mukhrach in Rashi, and this is based on Seder Olam, which is the rabbinic chronology of the events of Chumash, that Avraham Avinu was in Eretz Yisrael twice. Now, the problem is that when the Ibn Ezra, when he explains 400 years, he says 400 years mehayom. So the Ibn Ezra is trying to answer, how could it be 400 years? It's 210 years. The Ibn Ezra says, yes, but it's 400 years from the covenant. Now, not from the, right, from the covenant. So this Ibn Ezra is very, very difficult, because wait a second, if you're telling me it's 400 years from the covenant, right, then you got a problem. So when do you ever get 430 years? I mean, the Chumash itself gives a 430. Rashi says it's 430 from the covenant. So the answer I gave you was that the Ibn Ezra understands that Yitzchak was born the same year of the bris bein habsarim. Unlike Rashi, that says there's 30 years between the bris bein habsarim and the birth of Yitzchak, Rashi will actually learn it was all the same year. The bris bein habsarim, the bris milah, birth of Yitzchak, although it was a year later, but at least you're within one single year. And therefore, ultimately, the Ibn Ezra is moda that it's 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak, but the Ibn Ezra maintains 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak will also be 400 years from the bris bein habsarim. And the way you get 430 is, he's moda that Avraham had his first trip when he was 70, but that's not when the bris happened. Meaning, Rashi understands the bris bein habsarim was in his first trip. The Ibn Ezra will say it was 30 years after his first trip. That would be the difference. But that first trip at 70 was still going to be the case. Okay? Yeah.
Could a Jew in Eretz Yisrael, let's say Motzi Shabbos, send a text or an email to a Jew in, let's say, America, where it's still Shabbos, but if that Jew is a from Jew, and we can assume that he's not going to see it till after Shabbos, we don't want to forget.
Yeah. So that's a good question, in the sense that for sure that it's mutter. Meaning, if I send an email to a person while it is Shabbos for that person, but the Jewish person is not going to open it till after it's Shabbos, it's perfectly mutter, because I'm not causing the commission of a sin. If, on the other hand, I send it to a non-religious Jew who may open it and respond on Shabbos. In fact, I've had that problem a few times. Sometimes I didn't think, and I sent an email to somebody right after Shabbos, and the person sent me something back. Well, it's still Shabbos for them, and it's something to be aware of. That would be usher. The only place where there's a shaila is when you send, I don't know if people send faxes anymore. Do they still send faxes? If you send a fax, and the fax makes noise on Shabbos, you're actually activating a noisy machine where it's Shabbos, so some say that that's a bizayon for Shabbos. So it's better not to send a fax that will make a loud noise on Shabbos. But email is vaday mutter, as long as you're not causing someone to sin. In fact, the emes is, if you're sending it to a goy, even if they're going to respond on Shabbos, that's okay because you're not asking them to do so. If they're responding, right, I'm not allowed to ask a guy to do malacha, but if a guy decides on his own to do malacha on Shabbos, it's no sin, right? So I could send it to a guy even if he's going to respond on Shabbos, as long as I don't ask him for a response. And I can send it to a Jew who's not going to respond on Shabbos, but I should not send it to a Jew that's going to respond on Shabbos. Yeah.
Maybe in the morning share has been discussing today's morning share was discussing the role of Goyim and how about things that sort. And Rabbi mentioned how there's a specific ger that he knows of who I guess had bad experiences with certain rabbis who put down Goyim. I just want to know if Rabbi could elaborate that and say, like, I guess what is, in the bigger picture, what is the function in relation to the Jew of going in the world, and how should a convert relate to the parents of them who want to do it?
Yeah, as indicated this morning, this is, pedagogically, besides philosophically, which is your main question, pedagogically it's a very, very difficult issue. I mean, we have a yeshiva where people come from many, many different backgrounds. A person might be Jewish and their father may be non-Jewish, right? It happens all the time. We have people that are geirim, who both parents are not Jewish or their mother is not Jewish. And, they walk into a shir and there's someone, the goyim are this and the goyim are there and the goyim are that. And, hey, you're talking about my mom and dad, you're talking about my brother and sister. What's going on here, right? So educationally, I mean, I know I'm just talking tactically for a moment, but, tactically, that's a very, very explosive situation. And as I indicated, I know personally of a very fine person. He was a Ben Torah. I haven't been in contact for around 10 years, so I don't know where he is. I hope that he found his way back. His parents were not only goyim, his parents were missionaries. His parents were missionaries, and he was really brilliant, smart, learned, Baal Midos. But after a while, he says he could not stand. Every day he was hearing his parents being, they weren't deliberately doing it, his parents being denigrated, insulted, and the lot. So as a matter of education, you got to be careful. But the truth of the matter is, there's more than that. In other words, I'm not simply saying, keep the truth to yourself. The issue is the truth itself is much more complicated. Pirkei Avos says, Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem. Beloved is mankind who is created in the image of God. This is Rabbi Akiva says this. And then the next statement is, Chavivin Yisrael. Beloved is Klal Yisrael. Shenikra'u Banim Lamakom. They are called the children of God. So we have two statements. Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem, Chavivin Yisrael. Now, Chaviv Adam cannot be limited to Jews because that would make the second statement superfluous. You see clearly there are two statements. Chaviv Adam must refer to every human being. So the notion of Tselem Elokim, that a person is created in the image of God. Now, image, of course, does not mean physical image. God does not have nose and ears. Image refers to moral qualities, intelligence, free will, a sense of compassion, all of these things. So a cornerstone of a Jewish hashkafa is, we're special. We're the banim of God. We're the children of God. We have a special relationship. We are the firstborn of Hashem, whatever that means. B'ni b'chori Yisrael. But you also have to premise it on the fact that every single human being is in the image of Hashem. And because they are in the image of Hashem, they should be respected. We should look at them in a good way. We should acknowledge their dignity, their significance. So when people talk about, they say, let's say, American democracy is premised on the Judeo-Christian ethic. Okay, Christian, we don't want to call it Judeo-Christian, but that essentially means the idea of the dignity of a human being because they are in the image of God. And that is a powerful, important hashkafic idea that we sometimes don't pay attention to in the yeshiva world because we're busy kind of building up one side of the equation without recognizing the other side of the equation. So I've said many, many times that a chinuch any type of chinuch that is predicated on talking about how bad something is, whether it's goyim or whether it's other Jews, maybe we do more with other Jews than with goyim, that's not constructive. Don't talk about how bad other people are. Talk about how good Torah is, how good Yiddishkeit is, how good mitzvos are. Build up what we stand for. But it doesn't have to be by degrading what other people do with their lives. I mean, we can criticize hashkafas, we can criticize approaches, but not denigrating people. And I can tell you that among the Gedolim, I didn't know a lot of Gedolim, so to speak, but among the relatively small group of Gedolim that I was zochet to know, my Rosh Hashiva, Rav Ruderman, and Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, and Rav Moshe Feinstein, you saw, the one thing you always saw in them was a tremendous, tremendous respect for everybody, talking about the janitors, the garbage men, the nurses when they were in hospitals. And everybody was treated with so much respect, the chashivas. When Yaakov Kamenetsky died, he had been living in Muncie, although he spent literally the last 2 months in Baltimore. But he died, so near his house in Muncie was a monastery, not a monastery, a convent, nuns. And a yeshiva boy is walking in the street, and all of a sudden he bumps into a nun in full habit. There aren't even that many nuns who wear full habit anymore, but full habit. And he's like very startled, a nun in full habit with a big crucifix on the chest. So she says, "Do you mind if I ask you something?" So maybe she wants to convert him. What does she want? Ask him something. So he says, there used to be an old man that would walk the streets here, do you know where the old man is? He says, well, the old man was Yaakov Kamenetsky. The old man died. She said, oh, too bad. Every time he'd be taking his walk and we'd walk by, he always wished us a good morning and a good day. None of the yeshiva boys did that. And again, I probably wouldn't have done it either. I'm not saying that I'm any better. But who was the one who wished the nun a good morning every day? It was Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, because he saw the dignity of people, the chashivas of people. And that's the only real way you have to raise your children, by living that type of life. In fact, there's a beautiful story about Rashi. It may be a legend. I'm not sure if it's true. Some of these stories become legends, but the fact that they're told shows what type of person Rashi was. Rashi lived during the First Crusade. The First Crusade, where the Christians went through France and Germany and they massacred communities, was 1096. Rashi died in 1105. So towards the end of Rashi's life, by the way, Rashi was relatively young. Rashi died at 68. Can you believe what Rashi accomplished by not even reaching 70? But Rashi died shortly after the First Crusade. In fact, Rabbeinu Tam, his grandson, was almost killed in the First Crusade. But Rashi's city of Troyes in France was spared. By order of the archbishop of the area, Rashi's city was not touched. Legend has it that the basis was that 50 years earlier, this powerful archbishop was a poor, impoverished Catholic seminary student who was sleeping in the street because he had no place to go and no food. And Rashi, as a young rabbi, took him in, gave him a meal, and gave him a bed. Just for one night. 50 years later, this poor seminary student who had nothing became the very powerful archbishop who was making life and death decisions about Jews being murdered. He ordered that Rashi's city not be touched, because this was a rabbi that showed him kindness and compassion. So you never know where your kindness can take you. Right? You never know the kindness that we show. That's why Koheles Shlomo Melech writes, famous pasuk, Shalach lachma al pnei hamayim, you throw your bread on the waters, and you never know where it's going to go, but it'll come back to you in some way. So all I'm saying is that any hashkafa that's too much emphasizing negatives and too much emphasizes hate is not conducive to your own spiritual growth. You become a negative person. You're always, everything's critical. Every vort. Now I mentioned this morning a beautiful sefer on Chumash that I really loved. I loved it. I don't mention it, but I happen to love it. If you ask me, it's one of my favorite sefer on Chumash. And I liked it a lot. All of a sudden, I see it's being banned. It's being excommunicated. I'm getting letters from Lakewood. I have to burn the book, burn the Sefer. You know, it's almost a litmus test. If I like it, you know, somehow it becomes strafe. I don't know. But everything's negative. Everything's criticized. Everything's bad. Well, you don't grow as a yid that way. You don't grow in a yid. I mean, I understand. You're going to make the counter argument. Well, if everything's good, you don't have judgment, you don't have standards, you have to be able to say what, I hear, it's true. It's true. We have to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff. But we don't have to have this constant negative, degrading attitude about everything. I mean, I can look at a secular Zionist, and I could say there's a lot that's wrong with this. But the person does care about Eretz Israel, the person does want to do some good things in the world. So why can't I give him credit for that? Why can't I acknowledge? Why does it have to be all or nothing? Why does it have to be you're either a perfect tzaddik or you're a perfect Rasha? There are many, many levels that are in between those things. And I can look at someone and I can try to see the good in them and be cognizant of the negatives, but you know, I don't have to dwell on it so much. So I think that chinuch in that way has gotten very, very skewed, that we're so much focused on always identifying the negatives. Yeah?
On the same subject from a different angle, earlier the Rav on RAMBAM Perek Chelek mentioned that for going to get to Olam Haba, they have to really live in Mount Sinai, Mamad al Sinai.
Yeah.
So the question is, if they're really believing and sure about Mamad al Sinai, wouldn't they obviously expect them to go all in and convert?
Yeah, so that's a fascinating question. If the Rambam says, in order for me to be a righteous Gentile, I have to be convinced that God gave the Torah to the Jews at Mount Sinai, so why don't I convert? Why don't I become a Jew? The answer is, indeed, the answer must be, because since a righteous Gentile gets Olam Haba, a guy could very well conclude, why should I have to become a Jew? Meaning to say, God has given me a role in the world without being Jewish. See, that's a chiddush of Yiddishkeit. Most religions claim that the only way you can achieve salvation is by becoming their religion. Christianity certainly says that in virtually all of its forms, Protestant, Catholic. In other words, I mean, sometimes they'll be nice about it, they don't talk in the same language, except privately, but they say, you know, the only way you'll ever have salvation is by belief in Yashka. Islam says the same thing. Judaism is very unique among Western religions by basically saying you don't have to be, if you're not a Jew, you don't have to be Jewish. So yes, I believe that God chose the Jews. I believe that, this is what the guy would say, I believe that God gave the Torah at Har Sinai. But my role in the world is to be a righteous Gentile, and I will have Olam Haba by virtue of that, right? So as a result, a non-Jew might even think, maybe it's better for me to be a righteous Gentile than to be a Jew that falls short. Because once I become a Jew, maybe I can't keep all of those commandments. So this way I can be a righteous guy, you see? Yeah.
Here's a sentence. Is a woman allowed to get her eyebrows microbladed, or is this considered tattooing? She would choose to do this to feel more beautiful. The process involves a technician using a special tool to make tiny cuts in the skin. The tool consists of multiple needles connected to a handle. After the cuts, the technician smears on a color pigment into the cuts, creating the appearance of eyebrow hairs. This is a semi-permanent process. The ink fades away over time in about 18 to 30 months. They also need to get touch-ups every 12 months if they want. If allowed, would it create a hefsek for a woman in regards to a mikvah immersion, whether during the healing process where the skin might create scabs, or once the pigment starts to fade and its appearance might bother her?
Yeah, this is actually a very, very excellent question, and it's a very, very difficult question. You know, microblading, to have permanent eyebrows, is actually very popular among women today. And it raises very, very serious issues about tattooing, because essentially it is the process of tattooing in which you make incisions in the skin, fill them with dye. That's exactly what a tattoo is. And the Torah does prohibit tattooing. Little digression, every Jew in the world, conservative, reform, secular, Everyone knows that someone that has a tattoo cannot be buried in a Jewish cemetery. Everybody knows that, and that's totally not true. It's amazing. How did people get to hear that, and everybody knows it, and it's not true? We bury Machalo Shabbos in a cemetery. A tattoo will have a Jewish cemetery as well, so don't worry about that. You're not allowed to get a tattoo, but it will not exclude you from a Jewish cemetery. But pashtus, microblading is indeed a tattoo. The only heter that would justify it is the idea that since it does fade by itself, unlike a regular tattoo that stays forever, microblading does eventually fade. On the other hand, if you think about it, 18 to 30 months is not like, it'll fade in 2 hours or something. When people get a stamp on their hand when you go to an amusement park and they stamp your hand, that's not a tattoo because that could be washed off with water and that'll fade in 3 hours. But this is very different. So if you're asking me, lechatchila, should a woman get microblading? For sure she should not. Okay, but let's say she got it. Let's say she did get it. So the question would be, would the dye be a chatzitza, an immersion in the mikveh? Because normally when a woman goes to the mikveh, she has to remove makeup and all sorts of things. So the question, actually, obviously the person who asked the question did a lot of their own research and they know what they're talking about. And that is, as long as it's not fading, as long as it's not in a faded state, and the woman is perfectly happy to walk around and be seen with it, it would not be a chatzitza. Once it's in a condition that, you need to fix it, you need to rectify it, and, she's not happy with how it looks, that would be a chatzitza problem. So it all depends on the state that it's in at the time she goes to the mikveh. But in terms of allowing it lechatchila, it is at best a very, very questionable practice. Now, one other thing about tattoos, and this may be an issue that some of the guys face. All right, so I'm not allowed to get a tattoo, but I got a tattoo when I wasn't from. Now I'm from. Am I mechuyav to get the tattoo removed? So interestingly enough, you might think of doing that because you want to fit in, but halachically the issue is to get it, not have it. Once it's on you, there's no particular chiyuv to remove it. Ad kedei kach, that I heard a case, it's hard to believe a little bit, that a ger was told, a non-Jew who was converting was told, if you want to get a tattoo, get it now, and then you can keep it, but once you go to the mikveh, no tattoos anymore. So he was actually told, get a tattoo now, because Noachites are allowed to get tattoos. Now, there's a beautiful story, it's kind of an Or Sameach story a little bit, about a Baal Tshuva, though, who wanted to go to the mikveh, Erev Rosh Hashanah, but he was really, really embarrassed because he had a big tattoo, and in those days, it was very hard to remove. Now I think they have techniques that make it a little easier. So he really, really was determined that nobody would see his tattoo. So he kind of put on a robe and put on a towel and went into the mikveh, and at the last minute when he's under the water, he'd remove it, then right away put on the robe, put on the towel. And what happened was he slipped on the floor, and the towel started flying, and the tattoo was so visible. And he had the impression, it probably wasn't true, but he had the impression that all the people in the mikveh were staring at him, looking at him. He felt totally, totally humiliated. So there was an old man there who had been a survivor of the concentration camps. And he had a tattoo on his arm, his number. And he said, listen, I have one too. But today we go to the mikveh to purify ourselves to Hashem. So I'll be pure with my tattoo and you'll be pure with your tattoo. And we come together to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for a good year. Yeah.
After today's terrorist incident, let's say you shiva about a seminary girl or even a kolo couple will come over to Rabbi and say, I don't know if I could continue staying in there because it's just too nerve-wracking knowing that there's possibilities of.
After the pigua, you're saying?
Yeah, after the terrorist attack.
Yeah.
So, what would Rabbi respond to that? Is that? I know, obviously things come up in America also, but it is true. I think statistically that there are I think there is more attacks here than there are in America. So what would
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, well, first of all, so again, as I say, I didn't remark upon it, but again, certainly we should be mispalel for the people. Again, a young boy from yeshiva boy who from Canada was killed today. I mean, his parents certainly didn't expect they would lose their son coming to learn in Eretz Yisrael, and our heart goes out. And for the people in the hospital also, every single life is an olam malay, but Baruch Hashem, it was not as bad as it could have been. We have to be grateful for that as well. And Be'ezras Hashem, Hashem should bring shalom, and we shouldn't have the pigua and the like. But I'll tell you the truth. I know it scares people, but the old idea that somehow it's more dangerous here, it just is not true. I mean, maybe it was true at one point. Around 15 years ago, buses were being blown up and people were scared to go on a bus. Okay. Now, I mean, look at what's going on in America, the school shootings. You read what goes on in America, you will see it is a lot. It is not just a little, it's not just as bad, it's a lot worse that's going on here. It's quite amazing. I don't know if that's a comfort so much. I mean, in other words, you say, Israel is so dangerous. No, the world is so dangerous. Yeah, it's true. Go to Paris, go to London, go to New York, go to where is Disney World? Orlando, Florida. Go to Pittsburgh. Go anywhere. School shootings, murders going on. So I basically think, it's just simple. I mean, the world is dangerous. And if the world is dangerous, you might as well be here. Yeah, it's dangerous here, but it's dangerous there. You're not going to find a safe, unless you move to Montana, but if you're going to be in an urban area where Jews live, things are going to be dangerous. And if anything, I mean, I'm not an alarmist, actually, but if anything, the anti-Semitism in the United States is very, very much increasing. And Hashem is kind of sending messages that it's time for, Baruch Hashem, American Jewry had a very good run of, 250 years. It was very, very good, and we have to be very grateful. But all Gullus, the Gullus runs come to an end. In Spain, we were quite successful as well until the Spanish Inquisition. Germany, at least on a secular level, I mean, it wasn't so religious, but Germany, Jews were very, very prominent in science and literature and music. If you look at the Weimar Republic before Hitler, I mean, Jews were running the show, basically. And yet, you see what happened, So Galut comes to an end. So Hashem is kind of saying, time to come back home, So that's what I would say. And I would just compile what is going on in America and make them realize that it's not more dangerous here and it's not safer there. But Mayor Simcha used to say, every bullet has its address. And, it goes to where it has to go. And when it has its address, you could be anywhere, and the bullet will, unfortunately, follow you. Yeah.
Here's a sentence. If everyone in my building or kollel has cleaning help once a week, but I can't afford it, is it better to give meiser or provide my wife cleaning help?
Wow, that's a very, very excellent question. It depends on the wife, really, but if it really, really is mitzvah the wife, it is kedai to use it for your wife instead of meiser. Or to put it another way, you can use the meiser to help your wife, because if you can't afford cleaning help, then you yourself qualify as poor. I mean, listen, if I could give my meiser so he could hire cleaning help, why can't I give the meiser so I could hire cleaning help? I mean, it's not just other people that could be aniyim. You can be an ani, and you could benefit from your own meiser. And if this is a standard thing, now how you define an ani? So an ani doesn't mean I don't have enough money for bread or water. An ani means I can't live the standard within my normal community. If the normal community is a standard of getting help once a week, and I can't afford that, I am halachically poor with respect to that standard of living, and I can use my meiser to fill that gap. You see what I'm saying? That's the lumdus of it. So it's not help my wife instead of giving meiser. The other way around, I use my meiser to help my wife. That's a chiluk of the meiser itself. Yeah?
Certain groups on Hanukkah will light their menorah, like they say in a park, but they'll also put a bracha on it.
Is there justification for the
Yes, so certain groups. You mean Chabad? yeah. The basic idea that Chabad has popularized for many, many years the notion of public menorah lighting. Again, I love Chabad, and I don't want to get any negative mail or anything. And they do have some they claim they do have some halachic justification. So I don't want to say they don't. We can research that a little bit. But most poskim say that making a bracha is very improper, and the reason is because you can light a menorah anywhere you want if you're not going to make a bracha. But they say that the Hanukkah menorah is either lit in someone's home, or there's a special takana of lighting it in a Beit Knesset, in a shul, where you're allowed to make a bracha, because a shul is called a miniature Beis HaMikdash, so it corresponds. So I can make a bracha when I light at home, or in your home if I'm your guest, whatever it is, or I can make a bracha in Beis HaKnesses. But if it's a restaurant, if it's a park, and the like, I cannot make a bracha, because if it's not a home, the only heter of bracha is Beis Knesses. So most people, most poskim take the position that it's a bracha levatala. But Chabad does claim, Chabad claims that the takana of the Gaonim, that you can light in a shul, is not limited to a shul, it applies to any public gathering place. So that's the machlokas, meaning, do you extrapolate from Beis Knesset to Makom Tzibor, or do you say it's only Beis Knesset? That'll be the foundation of the machlokas. Yeah.
If one lives in a mobile home, like an RV or a yacht or a boat, do they need a mezuzah?
Yes, they do, as a matter of fact. Even though it's a moving home, if that is where you sleep and that is where you eat bikvios, that's your permanent place, as opposed to one night I sleep in my car because whatever it is, I stop by the side of the road, I don't have to get a mezuzah. But if this is my home, an RV in particular, so I do have to have a mezuzah on it. Yeah, that is correct. Yeah.
Is one allowed to use baby wipes on Shabbos?
Yeah, again, you'd be amazed at how common things are actually very, very big shilas. Baby wipes is an old, as old as baby wipes are, it's an old machlokes haposkim. And again, let's explain what the issue is. We know that one of the malachos of Shabbos is called sechita, squeezing liquid out of something which absorbs the liquid. Now, what malach is sechita? It actually is a tolda of dash. Dash is threshing. When you take grain and you take the seed out of the chaff that covers the grain, that is called threshing. Now, squeezing, now this is a little bit of an analogy, it's not so self-apparent. Squeezing liquid out of cloth is a tolda of threshing, because you're taking something that's absorbed and you're trying to take it out. Milking a cow, according to some, is threshing. The prohibition of milk, because the milk is covered by the cow's body and you're pulling it out of the udder. Now, so the problem with baby wipes is this. Baby wipes both have a surface moisture on top, and they have moisture that's absorbed in the cloth. So when you apply it with pressure, you're also squeezing out some of the water. So many poskim take the position that because water that's absorbed in the cloth is being squeezed out, it is prohibited because it's sechita. Others say if you do it gently, you're not necessarily squeezing out water, you're just using the water on the surface of the cloth, which technically would be mutter. So it is a machlokas. Many people have practiced not using a baby wipe. Other people are makel, but I do want to point out that even if you're makel, you must do it very gently. You can't rigorously rub it, because you would be squeezing out liquid under those circumstances.
My follow-up would be, you're responsible for, like, say, the covenant of of a child, and the only way to do that would be with the wife, would a person be like?
Well, not necessarily. Okay, let's ask this question. Let's assume that you take the position, baby wipes are usher. Okay? So the question is, so how do I clean my baby? Right? What is the alternative to baby wipes? So there is an alternative to baby wipes, but it's not the most pleasant thing in the world. And that is, instead of taking a cloth or a tissue that's absorbed water that you're squeezing out, you actually put the water on the baby first. You put the water on the baby and then take a dry piece of toilet paper or tissue and wipe it that way. There, you're not squeezing the water, it's the other way, you're absorbing the stuff. So that would be the alternative. I mean, listen, before baby wipes were invented, that's kind of how you did it. So that would be the alternative. So it's not that, God forbid, you're not leaving your baby dirty, for Shabbos, but you would clean them in that particular way. Yeah.
In regards to baby wipes, I heard from a post like that the liquid is not water. It's like chemicals, whatever.
Yes.
And
Alcohol. Yeah.
Whatever
Yeah.
it is, it's only like a carca that it's an issue of.
It's only what?
But the carca, only water that would be an issue.
Okay, that I'd have to see. In other words, in some ways, okay, I'm going to check that. That is very interesting. I mean, the problem is, you actually heard that from a posek, that the alcohol is not gedulei karka, right? And just be sure everyone understands this, that the issue of threshing is that which grows from the ground. Now, that includes milk, because since a cow eats grass, milk is called gedulei karka, so it does include milk, but it would not include chemical alcohol. So first of all, it would depend if it's grain alcohol or chemical alcohol, but it is probably true that most alcohol is chemical because grain alcohol is more expensive. That's why for chametz on Pesach, most of the time alcohol is not a problem. The only question is, though, and this is be interesting to, if you could ask the posek this maybe, is that they do add water to alcohol. They dilute the alcohol. So the question becomes, is like the water, well, actually, okay, I'm sorry. Well, water, yeah. Well, why is water called gedulei karka? That's an interesting question. I mean, is water gedulei karka? Can you squeeze water? I mean, water doesn't grow from the ground either, so I don't know. I'm going to have to think about it, but it's an interesting point. Yeah. Yeah.
So if Baal Teshuva grew up in a Native American culture and society,
Native Americans? Yeah.
And that, their belief system happens to be the same exact beliefs of Judaism, same exact belief of what Creator is and Hashem is. Are you allowed to integrate and assimilate those beliefs into Judaism?
This is a very, very subtle and a very, very difficult one. In theory, a certain amount of integration may be possible and even productive. A very good example, although this is controversial, is yoga and various other ideas, meditation, can sometimes be brought back into Judaism as ways that foster higher spiritual consciousness. And I imagine a similar process would be true with some aspects of Native American culture. The problem is that it may take a great deal of subtlety to discern what is consistent with Judaism, what might be pagan-based or something else. So I agree that theoretically it can be done, but you would need to kind of discuss with someone or at least think about this and work it out yourself as to what is truly consistent and what is not. By the way, you may know there is an old theory, I think it's been discarded, but there's an old theory from the 19th century that the Native Americans are actually remnants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel, and they originally were in fact Jewish, that after the Assyrian invasion, they found themselves over here. But people like to make the lost 10 tribes everywhere. I mean, they're the Vikings, they're the Native Americans, they're the Pashtuns of Afghanistan, they're the Ethiopian Jews. It could be all of them are. So we like to claim that everybody's Jewish. There's even a discussion if Shakespeare is Jewish. Okay, the whole issue there. But it may be a worthwhile endeavor, but you need to give it a lot of thought in that way. Okay, yeah.
Could you quickly define Yoshev as...
Yoshev, you said?
Yeah, when translating it as dwelling, does that have any conditions, like sleeping, eating? Are there any conditions to it?
Well, it depends. I mean, as you know, literally Yoshev means sitting. But for example, when we talk about sukkah, leishev basukah, right, we don't mean sitting necessarily, but we mean dwelling, regarding it as a dwelling place. I think that when Yoshev is used in a non-literal connotation to refer to dwelling, I think it refers to a place both where you normally eat and where you normally sleep. I mean, I wouldn't say there's a particular duration of time, but it's what you would call, I guess, in English, your domicile, what is considered to be your primary place of residence. Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, thank you. Be well. Hatzlacha Rabbi.